Hello, everyone. Welcome to Science on Tap. My name is Amanda Thomas, and I'm so glad you are here this evening. I'm going to share my screen and let you know a little bit about what's going on this evening. We are going to be talking about Heartbreak, a personal and scientific journey with Florence Williams. And Florence is a journalist, author, and podcaster. She is a contributing editor at Outside Magazine and a freelance writer for the New York Times, National Geographic, and a bunch of other publications you have heard of. And she's also written two previous books. The first one was called Breasts, A Natural and Unnatural History. And if you are a longtime follower of Science on Tap, you may recognize her because we had her on our stage a couple of years ago to talk about her second book, The Nature Fix, Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative. And you can see her on stage here. Hopefully we will be back to in-person events here one of these days. But if you are new to Science on Tap, I want to give you just a quick heads up or a quick description of what we're all about. We are an event series based in Portland, Oregon, and our goal is to make science accessible, fun, and meaningful, especially for adults. And if you have missed one of our previous shows, we've got lots of previous shows, and our podcast episodes are all on our YouTube page. And in fact, Florence's previous event is on our YouTube page as well. And the recording of it is, and our volunteers will put in the chat the link directly to our podcast episode on her talk from The Nature Fix. So it was a fun event. So as I mentioned tonight, we will be talking about Florence's newest book, which I think just came out on Tuesday. So it's very new. And in fact, she was on Fresh Air with Terry Gross this week, I think, which is very exciting to have her at our show after that. I just finished listening to the audiobook, which I really enjoyed. And there's a lot of, she has recordings, her voice recordings from various points throughout her experience. So if audiobooks are a thing that you enjoy, I encourage that. Otherwise, you can pick up the hardback copy as well. And while there are plenty of books, and if you've been to Science on Tap before, you know we've had plenty of events which are all about the science of falling in love. But this book is about what happens on the other side when things fall apart. And this book is a memoir of the aftermath of her 25-year marriage breaking up. And it's also a deep dive into the science of how heartbreak and trauma affect our bodies and our brains and even down to our genes. So here to tell that story, I will love to welcome Florence Williams.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Amanda. I love Science on Tap. It is great to be back here. Nice to see so many people from all over the place. And so early, in the sort of launch of this book. I really appreciate your coming out to hear about heartbreak. Hopefully it won't be totally depressing. As Amanda mentioned, I am a science journalist. And I often write about sort of the hidden or less seen connections between our physical and mental health and the world around us, our external circumstances or factors, sort of outside our body and how they influence our bodies. And since this is Science on Tap, I'm really going to tell a sort of three scientists walk into a bar story. Only in this case, it's three scientists walk into my heart. So this story starts, like so many heartbreaks, with a phone. One night, while I was cooking dinner for my husband and my two teenagers, some friends were about to walk through the door for dinner. My husband handed me his phone, and I was supposed to read a message on it from his brother. But instead, there was a message, an email from him to another woman talking about how much he loved her. So our marriage, I would say, unraveled sort of slowly at first and then quickly until one day he rolled his suitcase out the back door forever. And we had been married for 25 years. I actually met him when I was 18, my very first day of college. So we'd been together all told for 32 years. And this was a huge blow to me. It was unexpected. It wasn't kind of the way I wanted my life to work out. It wasn't what I had imagined how my life would work out. I had never experienced heartbreak before. I was stunned, really, not just by the emotional piece of it, but how it felt in my body. So that night with the phone, I actually felt like my stomach moved to a new location in my body and didn't really emerge from that location for a long time. I found out that my gut bacteria was really messed up. I ended up in the emergency room with really high blood sugars and an autoimmune type 1 diabetes diagnosis. I had tons of trouble sleeping. I was losing a lot of weight that I didn't want to lose. And these physical experiences surprised me. They baffled me. I felt like I just felt this sort of urgent need to try to understand, to take my science journalism hat and try to understand what was happening to me in a bid to try to get better, mostly, but also because I think probably that was kind of a way of dealing with pain for me that was just kind of automatic as well. So I'm going to tell you about those three scientists who would pick me back up and really change the course of the next years of my life, and ultimately really change the way that I felt about love and loss and what it means to be human. So just a few weeks after my husband left our home, I went to a conference, it was a science conference, and I ran into biological anthropologist Helen Fisher. And some of you may know her as the author of such books as The Anatomy of Love. And she is one of these people who writes a lot about what happens, the sort of wonderful feelings and the heady feelings that happen when we fall in love, the sort of neurotransmitters of love. But she's also one of the few people who has looked at what happens when that love sort of suddenly falls away. And I emailed her. I was also presenting at this conference, and I said, "You don't know me, but my husband of 25 years just walked out, and can I talk to you, please?" And she said, "Sure, kiddo, come on over." She's 20 years older than I am. She's incredibly warm and sort of maternal. She instantly sort of graciously invited me, into her hotel room, and we sat on her couch and drank tea. And she said, "Kiddo, are you sleeping?" And I said, "No." She said, "Are you eating?" I was like, "Not really." She said, "Do you feel existentially freaked?" And I was like, "Yes, absolutely." She said, "Okay, I can tell you why." And here's some of the things she said. She has put 15 dumped people in a brain scanner and looked at the parts of their brains that are activated when they look at pictures of their departing loved one. And what she's found is that two parts of their brains are particularly active. And one part is associated with craving and addiction. And she said, just because someone you love leaves doesn't mean you stop loving them all of a sudden. There's still a lot of yearning. There's still a lot of craving for this person, whether it's rational for you to feel this way or not. But your body has adjusted to having this person next to you, intimately next to you for decades or years and years, and your bodies co-regulate. Your heart rates co-regulate, your cortisol levels co-regulate, your respiration rates co-regulate. There's a sense of security and safety that comes from that. And when it suddenly disappears, your nervous system says, "Where is that person I'm used to co-regulating with?" It registers that as a sort of perilous new condition that you're facing. The other part of the brain is actually the part of the brain that normally registers physical pain. And it's a part of our brains. It's the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. It also regulates social pain. It's not a perfect overlay, but it's pretty similar. And it shows that our brains really take this kind of social pain incredibly seriously. These are long evolved structures in our brains. As human animals, she told me, of course, we're not only social, but we're hyper social. And we've been successful because we have found safety in numbers, safety in our kin groups, and beyond. We feel safe and secure when we're surrounded by people with whom we are attached and bonded. So what happens when we've been sort of rejected by a primary attachment figure is that our nervous system basically thinks we are lying alone in the savannah, on the savannah, being circled by hyenas. It doesn't really make a distinction between that kind of feeling of abandonment and one that's more based on just being rejected by love. And so we basically go into sort of a fight or flight state. And this is why she was, why she was telling me, this is why you feel freaked out. This is why you feel afraid. This is why there's so much norepinephrine and adrenaline coursing through your body that you're having trouble sleeping. And that you feel so agitated, both agitated and exhausted at the same time. So that was kind of a bummer because I did feel like I was in fight or flight. And she said, look, kiddo, here's the thing, pretty soon you're going to realize how great it is to fall in love with someone else. And she told me that she herself at this moment at age 70 was newly in love with the new man. And she was just glowing and, couldn't stop talking about how great it is to fall in love. She also said, you're also going to come to a point where you're going to tell yourself a story. And you'll find this narrative that makes sense for how you'll be able to move on and what you've learned from this experience. And I just, at this point, this is, like I said, 3 or 4 weeks after my marriage to the split, I wasn't ready to hear either of these things. I wasn't ready to hear about falling in love again with someone else. And I was like, what is the story? There is no story. I have no story. So that's where that left off. So here comes, scientist number 2, Stephen Cole. He's a professor of neurogenomics at UCLA. He, for decades, has been pioneering this field of how our immune systems really listen to our social state. Why our immune systems, in fact, change based upon whether or not we feel like we're alone on the savannah. So if Helen Fisher was telling me, here's why you feel so anxious, because your body thinks you're alone in the jungle, he was about to tell me, here's why you're getting sick, because here's what's happening to your genetic markers when you feel alone. His research started basically because he, in the 90s, was looking at gay men with HIV and why some of them were progressing to full-blown AIDS and disease and death sooner than others. And it turns out that it was the men who said that they didn't have a lot of social support, the ones who were still closeted, the ones who were anxious about their social state. These are the ones who were producing fewer T cells and who were dying earlier. Then he started looking at healthy people, but who identify as feeling lonely. So loneliness is a subjective feeling. You can be in a marriage and feel lonely. You can live in a big city and feel lonely. Or you can live alone and actually feel like you have a lot of friends and neighbors and community members who have your back and you don't feel lonely. But among people who feel lonely, we've known for quite a while that these people also die earlier. They have a much higher risk of chronic diseases, metabolic diseases, neurocognitive diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's, cardiac diseases, and so on. And so he started looking at their blood. And what he found eventually was that their transcription factors were different in a suite of about 200 genes that regulate our white blood cells. Now, why would our white blood cells want to do, as he put it, listen for loneliness? Sort of what skin do they have in the game of loneliness? But it turns out this is probably a long adapted response. Our immune cells get made in our bone marrow. They get made all the time. They're supposed to respond to circumstances in our lives. If we feel lonely, if we feel like we're sort of alone on the savannah, our white blood cells actually want to produce more markers of inflammation because, according to Stephen Cole, they are preparing for a blood wound, either an attack by a predator, more likely to happen when you're alone, or perhaps an injury, also more likely to happen when we're alone. But our immune systems can't do everything. So they make some compromises and they say, okay, if we're going to put out more inflammation, we're going to downregulate genes for fighting viruses, because we don't really need to fight viruses right now because you're alone and viruses get transmitted in groups. So he started telling me, all of these risk factors, for death and disease when you're lonely. And he said, in fact, these transcription factors are basically, he put it, a molecular soup of death. Exactly the wrong response we want in our immune system in modern life, when we know chronic inflammation can lead to these chronic diseases of modern life. And I said, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm heartbroken. I guess my body feels like I've been abandoned and I'm lonely and my immune system is freaking out. And he looked at me and he said, don't be heartbroken forever. In fact, he said, heartbreak is one of the hidden landmines of human existence. And we don't take it seriously enough because we tend to think that it's all in our heads. And it's a lot of sad. It's a lot of listening to sad music. It's a lot of lying on the bed, covering yourself in blankets. He said, but no, it's actually in our immune systems and it affects our health in a really dramatic and direct way. And when I told him, about my diabetes diagnosis and my divorce, he said, look, why don't you come into the lab and we'll take a look at your blood cells and we'll see if, in fact, your blood cells are acting like those of a lonely person. So it became clear to me that I needed a plan to not be heartbroken forever. I had no idea how to do this, how to get out of this. So here comes scientist number 3. So I'm at the University of Utah, and I go meet with a psychologist and researcher named Paula Williams. Paula Williams has been studying the markers of resilience. What is it that makes some people more resilient than others to the tragedies of life? And when I met with her, she said, yes, we know that divorced people do have an increased risk of early death. They have heightened risk of heart disease, 24% for up to 10 years after the split. Yes, divorced people may be worse off than any other demographic as far as social state, more than single people, long single people, more than married people for sure, and more than even widows or widowers. She said, but we do know that there are certain traits in some people that lead them to pretty much sail through this particular event and other life tragedies. And I said, what? I need to know what are those resilient people like and how do I become one? And she told me that her lab has been particularly focusing in on one personality trait known as openness. So, according to the 5-factor personality theory, we have a set of personality traits that tend to not be so movable over time. So you're either neurotic or you're not, you're introverted or you're not, you're conscientious or you're not, But the amazing thing about openness is that it does appear to be one type of personality trait that we can actually move the needle on a little bit. She's homing in on one part of the openness trait, and it is specifically our ability to be moved deeply by aesthetic experience. So openness in general, people who are high in openness are high in curiosity, they're high in sort of adventure, they welcome intellectual challenges, they like new experiences. And it turns out that, according to her lab, they also are able to experience aesthetic chill when they're confronting great beauty. So aesthetic chill, what is that? It's actually just a case of the goosebumps. Whether you're someone who gets goosebumps if you are listening to a symphony or looking at a grand vista or some other sort of awe-inspiring event. And this is sort of one of the definitions of awe, is that it can give you goosebumps. But it turns out that not everyone experiences goosebumps when confronting beauty. Some people do, some people don't. I thought that I did, but I wasn't sure. And she tried to convince me that we can develop a keener sense of the ability to feel awe. Now, why would this lead to resilience? There's some theories about this. We know from sort of the Human Connectome Project, looking at neural connectivity in the brain, that people who rate themselves as being very open also seem to have more white matter connections between their frontal cortex, which is kind of the seat of their self-concept, and the parts of their brains that process sensory and motor information. And she believes that people who are able to really cultivate and appreciate beauty are periodically able to sort of take themselves out of their personal experiences and their personal pain to make larger connections to things that are larger than yourself. So she thinks that these people are better able to process difficult experiences and tell themselves a story about growth and moving on. So here was the second time I was hearing this, to get better, you need to tell yourself a story about moving on. And you need to not necessarily just always think about your ex or think about your heartbreak. And by the way, Helen Fisher, at one point in her study with the brain scanner and the dumped people, she said that on average, these freshly dumped people were thinking about their exes 85% of their waking hours. So they're not necessarily thinking about the Milky Way or their connections to the cosmos. But if we can train ourselves to do this, perhaps we can have a leg up such that data is not destiny. If I was going to claw my way through heartbreak, I was going to have to awe my way through it. So it was that conversation that would determine the trajectory of the next 2 years of my personal life, and also the research for writing this book. So I think I'm going to end kind of my 3 scientists in a heart story there and welcome Amanda back, who and will ask me some more questions about this, and then we'll take some questions from you. So thanks.
Great, thank you. I'm going to start with a quick question from the audience just to kind of clarify something. You were talking about co-regulating, how people in a partnership co-regulate. Can you describe what that means?
Yeah, so our bodies actually kind of line up, and our physiological processes in our bodies line up with the people that we are living with very closely, especially an intimate partner. So we know even from brain scan studies, now they are making brain scanners that are big enough to put 2 people inside of. And if you put a sort of long established couple in one of these brain scanners and you give them a task to perform, parts of their brains will line up, they'll actually, the sine waves of brain activity in these parts of their brains will line up such that their sine waves are doing the same thing. And then if you put people who don't know each other well in a brain scanner and you have them do a task, that doesn't happen. We know this also actually happens with mothers and infants, that their brain wave patterns align. So there's probably some like really deeply evolved thing that goes on here in terms of synchrony and being able to sort of deeply and unconsciously communicate with each other. Probably really helps with child rearing, among other things. But yes, we know also cortisol levels align in the morning and in the evening in couples who live together. And we know that if one member of a couple or partnership, goes away on a business trip, for example, even for a few days, the person who's left behind will have higher stress hormones, probably because they're really sensing this sort of the sudden loss in this partner with whom they're used to, having their respiration rates the same and their heartbeats the same. And so there's this sort of reaction, this give and take that is suddenly gone.
I was intrigued to read about how, and you mentioned earlier how heartbreak and this kind of thing can actually, it's registered in the pain sensor area of your brain. And there's some evidence that taking pain relievers can help with that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So yeah, if our brains are processing social pain in a similar way as physical pain, can we help that pain by taking a Tylenol? Can we help it by smoking weed? Can we help it by taking opioids? Well, it turns out, yes, you can. And in fact, that's perhaps why we even have an opioid crisis right now, because there are a lot of people who feel lonely. And you can, to some extent, replace the high you get from the opioid receptors, the opioids of being in a relationship. You can replace that with synthetic opioids. But of course, there are risks to all these, and there's even probably risks to the Tylenol and to the weed. So I talked to a bunch of neuroscientists about this who study this, and they said, yeah, you could probably take a Tylenol. It will numb your pain, but we're also afraid that it might numb your ability to feel joy. And I thought that was a pretty big risk. Didn't necessarily want to go run home and start popping Tylenol.
So let's see, I have so many questions. Just briefly, what length of time does the book cover?
Mm-hmm. So it starts pretty much right after the split. And most of the book takes place in the first 2 years after the split. And there's just like a little bit of a kind of look back at year 3. And the reason I do that is because Dr. Cole, Stephen Cole at UCLA, we set up a bit of an experiment where we were going to take measures of my leukocytes and my monocytes and my transcription factors at various time points after the split to see if I was in fact getting better as measured by these transcription factors. And so we had a time 1, which was I think about 5 or 6 months after the split. Then I wanted to do a couple of big interventions, like this big wilderness trip that perhaps we'll talk about. And so I wanted to do another time 2 blood draw right after that. And then we did another one about 9 months after that. And then we had the conversation about it, some months after that, which was actually right before the pandemic set in, and ended up yielding some really interesting information just in time for the pandemic.
So one of the things that I found really interesting, and I really enjoyed your book a lot, but you tried so many different things. And I appreciate your investigative brain in that. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about some more. Obviously, you had the blood draws, but I'm thinking specifically about the one, and I can't remember the name of the researcher, but where you were shocked while you were looking at pictures of your ex and various people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that one was not really an intervention. It was more sort of designed to reveal whether I was still kind of feeling like I was in a threat state. So that one was in Naomi Eisenberger's lab at UCLA. What we did was they hooked up my fingers to these GSR machines that can basically read your nervous system, like how much are you sweating, how nervous are you, how much is your nervous system sort of like gearing up to be sort of face a threat. And then they showed me pictures of my ex, and then pictures of a support figure who was my father, and then pictures of a stranger. And this was like well over a year past the split. And then so I would look at all three pictures, and then they would deliver a shock to my wrist that sort of reminded me from that scene of the Princess Bride, where you're like turning up the shock machine in the torture room. So I would look at pictures of all these three people, these three men, would get the shock. Then I would look at pictures with no shock. So I would be sort of, I would learn to sort of decouple the fear response from, these figures I was looking at, these pictures. And then they would show me the pictures again, sometimes with a shock, sometimes it was a little sort of complicated. But the gist of it was that I was able to learn to disassociate the fear from the photos with my father and also the stranger. But I had a much harder time doing that with pictures of my ex, which showed that my body was still feeling like it was threatened when I looked at pictures of him. So even though I might have been feeling in some ways like I was moving on and feeling better, my body was still very much feeling like this was a threatening relationship.
In addition to some of these scientific experiments and interventions and whatnot, you did a lot of work around behavioral issues or methods as well. So yeah. Psychotherapy. I was really interested in your time spent outside. Obviously, the river trip is a huge part of that. And actually, why don't we talk about that first? Can you describe what your trip was?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I was so sort of desperate to get better and improve my health that I tried all sorts of different interventions that were kind of science-based, evidence-based interventions. And so I had written this book, The Nature Fix. So I was very invested in the idea and in the science that nature would help me calm down and feel better. But I knew I had this really big heartbreak, so I needed really big dose of nature. So I planned this 30-day wilderness expedition down the Green River in Utah. I had been a paddler, pretty much my whole life. It's something I did in my childhood, also something I did in my marriage. But I felt like the metaphor of the river was very irresistible to me. I now needed to learn how to paddle my own boat. And so that river trip was 30 days, but half of it was solo. I was so afraid of being alone, having never been alone. I felt like I need to go make myself be alone and access some bravery to be in that state. And also just the sort of metaphor of the river of flowing from something to something else, I thought perhaps could help me create this narrative that I was supposed to be creating, in which I was the pilot of my own boat and the pilot of the rest of my life. So it all sounded really good. I mean, I had all these really good ideas for why this was a good thing to do. But it didn't really work in the way I had hoped, in some interesting ways. And the reason we knew that is because of these blood tests that I did at UCLA looking at my transcription factors. And my transcription factors did not really like this solo expedition. They did not resolve to a state of my feeling at ease in the world. They still indicated that I was in a sort of threatening situation. And, after talking to Steve Cole about this, I mean, it really does make sense that, as humans, as I've said, we're not really supposed to be alone in the wilderness. And if we are, we may have some great thinking. It may be sort of cognitively helpful. There may be time to sort of work through some problems, but it's not necessarily going to relax us and make us really chill out, because we can't, you just can't screw up when you're alone. There are no roads, there's no phone. You can't get hurt. You can't get an infection. You can't tie your boat in wrong. So you're just alert. You're just alert. You have to pay attention all the time, which is, it's basically the same state you're in when you think you've been left on the savannah and you're circled by hyenas, because that's actually kind of where you are when you're in the desert by yourself. So I was like just putting myself right back there.
On a slightly less extreme time in the wilderness, though, in your book, The Nature Fix, and you also reference it in this book as well, you talk about, I believe, the 3-day rule. And can you talk about what that is?
Yeah. So in The Nature Fix, I kind of look at nature on a dose curve and the benefits that you get from nature right outside your window, nature on your block, nature in a park where you might spend a half a day or a day, and then the 3-day effect, which is what cognitive neuroscientist Dr. David Strayer has kind of popularized through some of his science, showing that we go through kind of a profound cognitive shift when we've been in the wilderness for 3 days, where we sort of leave the built world behind and our sensory brains really wake up in a way that also kind of deactivates our frontal cortex in perhaps a very helpful way, as we become more embodied and mindful in our surroundings. So a lot of cool things happen to us in 3 days in nature. And that's why I thought, well, I want more than 3 days. I want 30 days. I need a really big dose.
Yeah. You described in the book about how, I think it was one of your family members described how you did the sort of masculine muscling through instead of perhaps a more thoughtful way of dealing with that.
Yeah, she said you're taking on this sort of stupid patriarchy thing of like expedition, climb the mountain, muscle your way through your problems. And she's like, that's so dumb. Just hang out with your girlfriends and you'll feel so much better.
So obviously a significant portion of this book is about the science and the scientists and all of that. You do get into some pretty personal things as well, both your own interstate, I'll try that again, but also dating and hello, my cat. This is Pippin. Anyway, I'm curious what your thoughts are about dating. Did it help or did it slow things down? Can you talk about that?
Well, I was completely dreading it. I mean, I was 50 and had never dated before. I mean, I had been with the same person since I was 18. It's completely dreading it. And in fact, in a lot of the sort of heartbreak advice you hear, it's like, you're not ready. Don't jump into another relationship. You first need to love yourself. You need to heal yourself. And I would sort of roll my eyes and I was like, well, where's the science behind that? Is that really a good idea? Because on one of the podcasts I listened to about divorce, it said, for every year you've been married, you should wait 6 months before you date again. So that, for me, that would be 12 years. I was like, no, I'm going to be like spoon fed by then. So I wanted the science. And it turns out there's no science saying don't do it. And in fact, there is some science suggesting that rebounding can be really helpful. And that's, I think, so it's one of the sort of myths that I bust in this book, that in fact, people who rebound sort of sooner after a relationship, after a heartbreak, end up having more self-confidence and more self-esteem and are able to put more distance, between them and their ex sooner. So I did venture out into some dating with, I would say, very mixed results. And I recount only some of that, a taste of it in the book, just because of the science. I mean, I'm trying to just hinge my personal life on the science. And there was some science about why I had the bad dating experiences that I had. And some of that has to do with the documented drop in self-esteem that you face after rejection, and the lack of judgment, the poor impulse control. These are very well documented things that happen to us in heartbreak. And yes, I did experience it.
Well, and also Ennis was not a good communicator. We need to have some words with him, but yeah.
Yes, correct. It's a jungle out there, ladies. Yeah, absolutely.
So a little bit more about the science. We had a question about, is there any kind of research on the people who leave the relationship, on the dumper as opposed to the dumpee? And my recollection is that no, there's really not. And it seems like there's a dearth of research on this topic at all. Can you explain why?
I was curious about this too. And I asked Helen Fisher about it because she's telling me about all these things that I had to do and go through as a dumped person. And I was like, God, it all sounds like such a pain in the ass. Like, this is so much work, all this storytelling and, all of these meaning making and, calming down. And what about the person who leaves? Like, does he just skate away? What happens there? And she said, we don't know. We've done more research on the dumped brains than we have on the dumper brains. And some probably do skate away, but I also think, I think a lot of the people who choose to break up a long relationship like this also have a lot of pain. I mean, there's a lot of guilt, I'm sure, associated with this. And I think there's probably a big variation in how much pain people feel.
It also seems like there's a lot of people, Helen Fisher, for example, who are studying the effects of falling in love and all of the wonderful things like that. And there's just really not anybody, or not many people anyway, talking about this thing that is a huge part of people's lives. And I'm surprised by that. And so if any of you are scientists watching, you should, it's a field to go into.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book. I just felt like there isn't a lot of understanding about how really profound we take heartbreak and how we feel it in our bodies, and the urgency to really help each other through it.
So I am going to start looking at some of the questions. So if I'm looking off to the side, it's because I'm looking at my computer here with all the questions in here. So Deb asks, do you think our isolation during the pandemic has created grief-like responses? I lost 15 pounds and I walked more, but yeah, that seems unusual. So you mentioned that your book kind of ends at the very beginning of the pandemic, but I'm wondering, since you have, since that time, what have you learned?
Yeah, I mean, the weight loss is definitely a symptom of, feeling threatened, and your nervous system being sort of too amped up to sort of digest food really well. That doesn't become a priority when you're feeling freaked out. And certainly, I think there are many lessons of heartbreak that seem to be relevant to a lot of us during the pandemic. The social isolation, feelings of loneliness, feelings of grief. so many lessons from Heartbreak that I think are relevant. And we know too from just these viral studies that not only Stephen Cole's work looking at human blood, but now there are a number of animal studies, for example, with chimps, where chimps are given SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, and then socially isolated, put into cages by themselves. Because scientists are interested in studying, one, how are we treating lab animals? And are we messing up the science by inadvertently messing up their immune systems if they're caged in isolation? But two, because we're interested in virus progression in primates and what it can tell us about humans. And so we know that in these socially isolated chimps, they progress to disease much more quickly. And their immune systems aren't putting out these T cells and a number of other immunofactors. So we're in a pandemic. We need to be able to fight viruses, and actually being socially isolated is kind of one of the worst responses we can have as far as strengthening our immune systems. And so we really need to be thinking about ways not to feel lonely in order to protect our ability to fight viruses. And some of the researchers I spoke to said, we need to be potting up. That's really important. Just retreating might not be the right response, or at least it's a complicated, contradictory response for fighting a virus.
There is another question from Warren, and talking about how you said openness can help us bounce back from heartbreak. Just curious about being extroverted versus introverted and how that plays a role in resilience.
Yeah, good question. It seems like there may be some correlation between openness and extroversion. The extroverted people do sometimes tend to be more open to new experiences and sort of more sociable anyway. But introverted people can do this too. I mean, introverted people are the deep thinkers sometimes. They're the ones who really feel things. And that actually is associated with the ability to feel awe. So if you're an introvert, you're actually not at all, I think, at a disadvantage. But cultivate that, think of that deep thinking as an asset, right? And so much of this is about our framing. Again, this gets back to the story that we tell ourselves. If we tell ourselves that our deep thinking introversion is an asset and will help us create the story of our future, then perhaps it will, because it's all about the story you tell.
Well, then I'd like to address the idea of awe again. You talked about that a little bit, and you mentioned in the book that you are yourself an introvert, but you can go out into the woods and feel that kind of awe. Can you talk a little bit about how, because for example, Vicky asks, it's not clear what can be done, what interventions, especially less costly and not a research subject. Oh, hey. So can you talk about how somebody who might be experiencing something like this, obviously you can't be super prescriptive, but some methods they might try?
Yeah, I can. So, awe, it doesn't have to be the Grand Canyon. It's possible to gain a lot of health benefits from even sort of what I call microdosing awe. And I know this because there's some emerging research about this, that so there's this great acronym for AWE, that if you even go walk down your street and find some bird singing or a tree or a blossom, the A is attend, be attentive, notice something beautiful, and the W is wait. So just sit with that moment of beauty, and the E is exhale. So even just take a few breaths while you are taking in this beauty. It's a 2-minute practice. And if you do it a couple times a day, there is actually some emerging science suggesting that this has some significant benefits in terms of people's well-being. There are a lot of theories. There's a lot of science of awe that I didn't really go into tonight. I go into it more in the book, but it does seem to sort of slow down or even stop our sort of rumination and our negative thinking long enough to make us feel connected to something else. And that seems to be sort of one of the key kind of mechanisms for why this is so helpful.
We've had a couple of questions from folks who are interested in knowing what the difference is between a loss from a divorce versus loss from the death of a partner. Would you talk about that?
Yeah. There are a lot of similarities, actually. In both cases, there can be a sense of abandonment. There can be a sense of rage. There can be a lot of grief, right? A lot of loneliness. And researchers who are studying grief and bereavement after death, I think, have a lot of insight for those of us suffering from other kinds of attachment losses. Heartbreak can be, in some ways, a more ambiguous kind of loss, where you've lost a partner, but they still are around. You may be still co-parenting with them. It's less of a sort of final sense of loss, and in some ways that can be really challenging. And then often for many of us who are heartbroken, there's also this layering of rejection, that sort of ostracization piece, and there's a lot of emerging science behind that, and sort of the destructive behavior that particular set of emotions can engender. So both of them are complicated and hard.
You don't really touch on this in the book, so you may not have a good answer for this, but there's a question about this kind of reaction in children. Are there any kind of research, or is there any kind of research around how children deal with this kind of a loss, or how they can get better?
So we know that adolescents take romantic heartbreak really, really hard. Their brains are even more socially sensitive to cues of rejection and status than adult brains. And so for adolescents, it can be really, really rough. And in fact, romantic relationship breakup is, I think, the leading, or one of the two leading factors of teen suicide. So something that needs to be taken very seriously. It's one of the reasons probably social media is even, so bound up in teen suicide and in teen and adolescent depression, because it's so much about your status and how many likes you have and how your peers are viewing you. So I think actually there's kind of very related work.
I was just reminded about physiological effects of this kind of thing, and I was intrigued to learn about the Takotsubo heart cardiomyopathy. And can you explain what that is?
Sure. Yeah, there's a kind of heart failure called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy that is directly related to an emotional blow. Sometimes it happens in people who've just lost a partner, or even people who've just lost a pet. There are cases in the scientific literature of people suffering this when their soccer teams lose at the World Cup. And it does not present as a normal heart attack. It's not because of a blocked artery or piece of plaque breaking loose. It's actually because there's such a huge flood of stress hormones that they kind of stun the left ventricle of the heart in a way that it distends out and can't pump anymore. And so I think it's about 5 to 10% of all sort of heart failures that end up in the hospital are this kind of Takotsubo. And about 5% of them will result in death. And about 20% of people who suffer this will go on to have some heart disease risk later on. So it's kind of, we think of heartbreak as being a metaphor, but there is actually this literal heartbreak that happens.
Well, in the book, you talk about the survivors of the tornado in Joplin, was that it? And
Joplin, Missouri. Yeah.
yeah, and the women who were on the hike, the survivors of trafficking, and I just want to reassure the folks who are listening this evening that this book covers a wide range of different kinds of heartbreak. It's not only a relationship, although that is certainly a interesting and very relevant framework on which
There are a
to
lot
talk
of
about
kinds of
this.
heartbreak. There's heartbreak from climate change. There's heartbreak from watching your home change, and species loss and social injustice. And unfortunately, we live in a world with lots of opportunities for different heartbreak, but also lots of opportunities for intervention. We didn't even talk about the psychedelics or the EMDR. I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff in the book too.
Well, let's talk about that. What are some of the other more creative interventions you did?
Well, I mean, just getting back to awe, I was so determined to try to experience awe in all of its technicolor possibility, that, when the river trip ended up being a little bit of a disappointment as far as my leukocytes, I was convinced by another psychologist I talked to try psilocybin in a therapeutic setting to experience a really big awe. and there's actually a paper, I think we can put it in the chat, looking at awe as perhaps the mechanism, the reason why some of these psychedelic therapeutic journeys are so helpful for people suffering trauma. And awe may be kind of the key to it, which I think is really interesting. So I traveled to Portland, your town, and worked with a practitioner, a therapist there. And for the first time, did MDMA and psilocybin. And I did truly have a kind of mystical, awesome experience that I think really, really was very helpful for me, actually. It made me feel less afraid of the future, made me feel like my own problems were not very significant. I had this really clear insight that I was just made up of molecules. And I had a vision of a bead curtain, and I was just a bead in this bead curtain, and everyone else were beads, and we couldn't tell who was who. And I was like, our emotions are just molecules. They're chemical signals. Like, why? Everyone's just a molecule. Why do we take it so seriously? No, and I was actually, like, weirdly, it truly was helpful to me.
Did you have, I think you mentioned that there were some ongoing physical effects, though, as the dopamine receptors perhaps are not as active after that?
Oh, serotonin. Well, so when you take MDMA, basically what you're doing is you're sort of like really flooding the serotonin receptors. And there can be kind of a hangover, serotonin hangover the next day, which I did feel. I mean, I just had a bad headache, and I was, seriously grumpy, for a day or two.
So, any sort of last thoughts? I have one more question I want to ask you after this, but it feels to me overall, after reading or listening to this book, that it is very hopeful. That it's talks about some difficult things, but that there are you come through to the other side. Any last thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I hope it is hopeful. I do eventually, I think, through these various modalities, and I do think that, beauty is this kind of unacknowledged antidote to so much pain and so much social pain. And I felt like through that path, I was able to come to a place where I could write myself into a new story. And I actually feel like a different person in some ways from before my personal tragedy. I feel ironically that the heartbreak has made me more capable of love and more capable of joy and of beauty. And it has given me this sort of renewed sense of, how to move through the world in a way that I'm more present for the people in my life. And I'm more present, I think, for my community, more interested in hearing other people's pain, seeing other people's pain, sort of meeting people from an authentic place. And so, yeah, I mean, I think they're really, as skeptical as I was about this sort of transcendence and transformation that was possible, I do feel like I kind of got there. Not every day, not all the time, but most of the time.
Well, my final question, as I mentioned to you earlier, we've been asking all of our speakers to answer the question: why do you feel it's important for people to learn about science?
I feel like science is a pathway to awe. There's so much out there when we learn about how the world works, that will blow your brain, and we know that that's really good for us.
Well, thank you. And I know that there were a bunch of questions that we didn't get to, and I apologize for that. But I encourage you to pick up the book or the audio book. And what is it that Find Awe? The what is the subtitle of that?
Oh, this is from an organization in DC that takes kids out into nature called the Elements DC.
Great. Yeah. So let's see. Oh, yes, there's the book.
And the audiobook's great. Check it out.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it a lot. So thank you, Florence. Thank you so much for sharing in your book and for sharing this evening. And I am going to just kind of finish up with a few quick things related to just wrapping up the event. And so we'll say goodbye to Florence for right now and continue with my slides briefly. And again, here is the book cover. I strongly recommend picking it up. I also, I want to say a quick thank you to our Patreon supporters. You're hanging in there, and we don't have a lot on our calendar coming up that's public yet, but we have a big event in April that hopefully we'll be able to do in person. We haven't announced it yet because we're not sure of some details, but it's going to be good, I promise you. So thank you so much to our Patreon supporters for helping, and to all of you who purchase tickets and are donating to us. That really makes a huge difference and makes it so that these events can happen at all. And if you feel so compelled, I encourage you, if you would like, you can help support us. We are hoping that our future events, when we go back to in-person events, that we want to have live stream as well, so that folks who are not in Portland, or who are in Portland and don't want to drive across town and find parking, that we can do a live event in person and also project it on online as well. So, but that takes some time and equipment and whatnot. So if you are interested in something like that, we would love your support. If you bought a ticket, that's great. Thank you. That's all I'm going to say for that tonight. Thank you so much again, Florence, for joining us. And thanks everyone. Have a good evening.